Welcome to the virtual book launch for Linda Castillo and another exciting Kate Burkholder book. You can see, ranged here, that Linda has autographed our copies and shipped them to us, and we're delighted to have them and hope that you will buy one and encourage her to keep writing. Although, how many books is this now? Is this book 12?
Yes.
So you probably won't get discouraged.
No, I'm actually about 3/4 of the way finished with the next book, Barbara.
Oh, I'm delighted to hear that. One of the reasons that I absolutely love your series is I never know what to expect from a Kate Burkholder story. And I think in Outsider, you surprised me once again because you really made it a thriller. It's different than a police procedural. What inspired you to write what is almost a classic thriller of an antagonist and a protagonist, and they duke it out going down the road, and your hope is that the good guy will win, but you're not sure?
That I didn't even realize that I had done that until I heard you mention that earlier while we were chatting. And it really is all about the story and the way that I approach the story. This particular story lent itself to that. Usually it's sort of a whodunit, and we follow Kate as she goes through the police procedural elements, usually with Tomasetti somehow assisting. And this one really was different. She was a little bit, she sort of course, knew what was going on as far as the investigation, simply because she's the, chief of police of Painters Mill, Ohio. But I think she also, this time, she was a little bit removed from that aspect of the investigation. It was a little bit more personal for her.
Well, that's exactly right, because the woman who sparks this all off was a classmate of Kate's at the academy, what, about 10 years back? Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
And
I would say 10 years, maybe a little bit more than that.
right. And while they were classmates, I don't know that they were necessarily, they certainly weren't BFFs. They were different temperaments. But when this woman is in extremis and stranded near Painter's Mill, she does hope that maybe Kate will help her. And the good news about this is that we get to learn a lot of things about Kate's early life. You circle around it in various of the books. But this one, you were able to bring in a lot of Kate's backstory that we didn't previously know.
Yeah. Well, with this book in particular, Gina Colarosa is, she is the one of the main characters as Kate's sidekick from back in their police academy days. She was actually mentioned in the first book, and so I always knew of her existence. And I learned things about Kate Burkholder in this book that I didn't know before.
Uh-huh.
And I think as young women, the friendship between women, especially young women, I think maybe when trust comes a little bit more easily. I think for a while early on they were, very, very close, although you were right, they had very different temperaments. And Gina is basically the young woman who taught Kate how not to be Amish. And I think, good or bad, that she is probably Gina has helped Kate and set her on the path to where she is today, as far as her career in law enforcement.
Oh, no question about it. I mean, she certainly wanted to kick up the traces, buck the rules somewhat. Tough. I can easily see that she would have been a strong influence on Kate, and probably at that time for the better. But what's happened is it's led her into a really horrible situation in the Columbus Police Department, where she has wound up. So do you think, what did you see with her? Was she there because she was reckless? Was she there because she was pissed off at not being one of the boys? What got her into the mess that she got into?
I think that Gina, even from, this is one of the books where I actually do use, I go back and flashbacks. I use flashbacks to sort of illuminate, how some of these things, what happened to Kate, how she came to be the person that she is today. And Gina Colarosa I think from the get-go, you knew that she's a little bit rough around the edges. You knew that she is, she puts herself out there. She is very fallible. She's strong-willed and she's rough around the edges. She's just that kind of person. And Kate being, relatively innocent. I mean, she had been raised Amish. She had never really been in that kind of world before. Kate was very intrigued by Gina, and was a major influence. And I think early on they became close. And I think it didn't take Kate very long, to realize that Gina, not everything is good when it comes to Gina. She's not, maybe not the kind of person that she should model her own life after.
Well, I certainly think that's true. I mean, however much Kate kicks against her Amish upbringing, it has shaped her as a moral person, as a basically kind person, a person inclined to do well. In fact, I often think it's hard for her to think badly of people, which, as the chief of police in investigating crimes, she often has to. I can think of at least one of the books where she just couldn't imagine that what happened could be happening. It's the one that starts with the carriage crash. I always come back to that because that is such an incredibly cruel book. But I do think it was hard for Kate to see her way towards the resolution of that book, because everything that she knew, even the unkindness in her own family, was never that extreme.
Yeah, and I think, if you think about in terms of Kate being chief of police or a cop, that is a little bit of a handicap. And I wouldn't really call her, maybe not naive, but I think you're right, Barbara, in that she really is. It's a little difficult sometimes for her to see, evil in other people, or, those kinds of, bad traits, that sometimes they're just bad eggs out there. And I think Kate Burkholder is basically an optimist. And that's, sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes when you're a cop, I think maybe not so much.
Definitely. No, I agree with that entirely. I do think that she's inclined to think most Amish are going to be good and behave. Now, I was talking today to Keith McCafferty. Remember, we did a very entertaining event with Keith, who it turns out grew up in Amish country. He grew up not terribly far from where you are. And he pointed out to me that when he was young, he can remember that he and his dad drove in a car down to, I can't remember, must be the river, probably the Ohio, but some river they were going to fish in and all. And then they got out and they got into their little wooden rowboat, with the oars, and they set out and all. But meantime, coming towards them was an Amish man and maybe a couple of them in a horse and buggy, and they clip-clop along, and they get to the same landing, and they get out of the buggy, and then they step into a boat with an outboard motor, and they motor off. And Keith says he still remembers trying to reconcile the horse and buggy and then the outboard motor boat, and how come one was okay, and then how come the horse and buggy was required and then the motorboat was okay? Have you run into anything like that?
I actually have. And, it really, everything boils down to the church district and what's called Yatnang, which is sort of that's the unwritten rules of the church district. And, for example, when I went to, when I was in Ohio one summer, I was actually on book tour, and I was on a dairy farm, and in order to milk the cows, they used machines. They weren't allowed to use electricity, and so they used a generator. And I think in this particular church district, they were allowed to use, for example, they could use diesel fuel in a generator, but they were not allowed to use gasoline. And so there are some real, it just depends on what the rules are in that specific church district. And there are some of the, the Swartzengruber, the very conservative, very traditional Amish. They are so strict that they don't even want to use the slow-moving vehicle signs, which could conceivably cause a buggy crash if it's at night and a car can't see the buggy. And then you have other guys have a radio in their buggy. So it really depends on, and and I think there are some Amish out there who, if they can get away with breaking a few rules, then they're going to do it, and they can, do their confession and atone for it later.
Well, the whole Rumspringa thing I've always found fascinating too. That basically, all rules are off. Anything is available to these kids, and the idea, I guess, is they kick over all the traces, and then they choose to come back and lead a good Amish life. But
Yeah.
it's certainly possible teenagers have such poor judgment that some of them can do really terrible or unfortunate anyway things while they're in that gap year and may never really recover from it.
Well, I was talking to it's actually a chief of police in a small town north, so a little bit north of Amish country. And a lot of these Amish kids, and teenagers, they do lead somewhat of sheltered lives. And when they become, of the age that for their spring of, 16, 17, 18 years old, before they have committed to the church, they're not prepared for those freedoms, and they can't handle it. And I think that's why, I read a story out of it was Holmes County, Ohio, where there was this giant party called an Amish. They call it a rager, and they have food trucks, they have bands. It usually will take place in a big German bank barn or field, at night. A lot of people know about it, but usually not the adults or law enforcement. Usually there's dope smoking, there's alcohol, rock bands, country bands. There, in this particular case, there was something like 74 arrests of minors. They were arrested for drinking alcohol, which I thought was just the craziest thing. That's the last thing you expect to hear about the Amish. So it was a very, very interesting article. This took place probably 2 3 years ago.
I wonder if they're coached to have protected sex.
Oh boy, that's
seriously.
A good question.
Yeah, because
I don't know.
well, it could have life-changing consequences if they don't. So
Yeah.
I wonder how much prep, if there's like a conversation before they head out on their Rumspringa years, or whether it's just hope that they will figure it out.
I do not think, generally speaking, I mean, you can't really lump everybody, together like that, but generally speaking, from what I've read, I don't believe those conversations take place. And, of course, the young people speak among themselves, so they may figure a few things out that way. But just from what I've read, and I've not asked that personal question, but I doubt that those conversations take place.
Well, I'm probably giving you a plot point for a book down the road.
Yeah, there could be a book in there somewhere. Yeah.
Interesting. In fact, I was at Mayo today for my annual physical, and my doctor pointed out to me that masks during COVID are the equivalent of condoms during AIDS. And I thought, boy, that was an interesting,
Oh.
But she's right. That you need protection, and a big problem.
Yeah.
A big problem was getting people then to wear condoms, and as we both know, a big problem at the moment is to get people to wear masks and avoid thinking of them as political statements. But
Yes, that's absolutely correct. That's actually a really good analogy. I mean, that sort of puts things into perspective.
I thought it was too. But anyway, I would think that some of these kids could being unprepared, could really get themselves into more trouble than they can imagine. So another thing I thought was great about Outsider, I mean, Painters Mill is not a giant urban area, and there's an amazing amount of crime that seems to happen in Painters Mill, although probably not exaggerated in terms of the population. But it is good that you can either send Kate away, like you did one time to upstate New York, where she's able to work something outside of Painters Mill. But here, in fact, the crime comes from Columbus, and there are scenes in Columbus, a great opening scene, one of your electrifying opening scenes. But then it all heads towards Painter's Mill from Columbus, and part of it is this incredible blizzard because you have set this in the dead of winter. Actually, you set it before Christmas, if I think back now, right?
I think so. Yes,
So,
I should know that.
yeah, well, but I think it's refreshing when you're able to bring in outside elements. I mean, Thomas Eddy has a statewide remit, so he can bring elements in that are not just local to the Amish community. But it's also helpful when Kate spreads her wings some and has to deal with stuff that is not just pure Painter's Mill.
Right. I totally agree that that was actually one of the challenges of writing this book. I did open. I loved the opening scene, the prologue. I loved writing that scene. And it was a challenge. With the thriller, you sort of there's something out there. That there's danger out there, and it could strike at just about any moment. And if you look at the Amish farm, Painters Mill, Ohio is a very bucolic town. Here we are. We have an Amish widower, Adam Langotcher, his three little children, and then enter rough around the edges Gina Colarosa, who has frankly, she has a bit of a mouth on her, and so you have automatic conflict there, and I know it's somewhat of a cliche, but I do love the weather element. And I think in any, weather element is always kind of an interesting thing. But if you think about it in terms of the Amish, some of the Amish don't, there's no central heating, potbelly stove, fireplace, or maybe a kerosene heater to keep the house warm. Even the addition of livestock, it really makes for a hardship. And so these are some of the underlying things that are going on while, Kate and Tomasetti are sort of trying to figure out exactly what's going on. And then you have the added element, the contrast between Gina, this outsider, being in this sweet Amish home. And then, one of the themes that sort of runs throughout the whole book is this element of trust. Kate isn't sure. She once loved Gina, and they were good friends early in their lives. But the question arises more than once: can she trust her?
Yes, that certainly is a big question, and also there's a certain amount of tension generated because Gina is not above flirting with the sweet and very vulnerable Amish widower. So among all the other things we're worried about Adam, because clearly Gina is not going to be the perfect stepmother to his kids or addition to his life, and yet he's risked a lot to look after her because he is such a good person. And
Yes.
you can see why that would make him attractive to Gina, who was feeling very unsafe. Well, she is unsafe. People are trying to kill her. And I thought that added an interesting element. Kate and Thomas Eddy more or less resolved their romantic relationship, and now they're just working out, living together, and so forth. So it was nice that you brought in a sort of will they, won't they tension through this
Yes.
other pairing or not pairing in the book.
And that was actually a question that I had to work through myself.
I'll
Will
bet.
they or won't they? And I don't want to give away too much about the
No.
book, but it was a little bit of a challenge. And I think what helped me as a writer getting that scene right, and one of the things I always try to do, Barbara, is I always try to depict the Amish in an honest way. And sometimes that means, they're not perfect. They're human beings just like us. They make mistakes. Generally speaking, they follow their tenets, and, they're, religious, and so on. But, I struggled with that, and I think I think I wrote it the right way. So but it was a challenge.
I think you wrote it the right way too, and I also think that it was not at all apparent what the right way was going to be until it actually happened, which is good. It was not predictable, and it was part of the tension of the thriller. Overall, you had several elements that were nail biting in this book. Which I mean, I love police procedurals. I grew up on authors like Del Shannon, who was, believe it or not, the first woman who actually wrote police procedurals, and she had a Mexican detective called Lieutenant Luis Mendoza, and in her books, they behaved like cops in a real precinct, in that they were working several cases at once. There would be a sort of a lead case, but they were always working several investigations at once, and the lead case was like the pull-through, for the story, but nonetheless other stuff got resolved. We just reissued that as a Library of Congress crime classic, the first Del Shannon, Luis Mendoza, and I'm delighted that we did, because she was a pioneer in this genre. So I've always liked it, and I love the fact that Kate is a police chief and doing a good job, and it's also an interesting book to bring out just at this moment when there is so much controversy about the police.
Yes.
I myself think defunding the police is nuts. What they ought to be doing is spending more money training and recruiting and training, and also moving some of the really difficult issues away from the police into other hands. Domestic calls are just a death trap for cops often, and they're not really trained to resolve that kind of thing. So it'd be great if these conversations produce better police departments. We can't do without them, but we certainly could reform them, and we probably ought to be throwing more money at them in order to achieve that. So books like yours, I think, help remind us of the good things about having strong police enforcement, and how we'd all be in jeopardy all the time if we didn't have it. Even that experiment in Seattle did not work out for very long when you left it to self-policing.
Right, absolutely. I think you're absolutely correct. And it was the police procedural element. I'm a huge John Sanford fan, and I read every Lucas Davenport book. Love it. Read I think I'm a couple of books behind, but I love the whole police procedural element. But I think one of the challenges of writing a series, especially like the Kate Burkholder series, I think one writer, and his name is leaving me at the moment. He said every book that you write has to be better than the one before it. And I think one of the challenges is, especially when you're writing a series, is to keep the books fresh. And I wanted to do something just a little bit different with this book. And so, yes, I kind of steered away from the police procedural element. There's still a little bit in there, and, still required, research and stuff like that. But I think you're right in that the thriller aspect of this book really overrides that police procedural aspect.
Well, it certainly is an exciting read. I enjoyed it. Well, I loved all your books. And it's nice to have read them in real time, too. And I will say to any of you watching this that the best way to read the Kate Burkholders really is to start from the beginning, because the plots are all different, but the characters, their lives keep developing, and you do lose a little bit if you wander in.
That's absolutely true. It really, the books are sort of standalone, mysteries or police procedural or whatever that book is. But what you lack if you don't start with that first book, especially the first book, is the backstory on the characters. And in these books, it's really meaningful, because you learn why and how Kate left the Amish lifestyle, and that's actually a bit of an unusual thing. Something like 80% of Amish kids or young people, I shouldn't say kids, after Rumspringa, 80% of them go back to the Amish way, and so it's a huge percentage. So Kate is quite a minority in that aspect.
Well, and there are relationships that develop with, other people in the story, because you do develop,
Oh, yeah.
inevitably in a series you do develop more characters, and they tend to stick around or they fade away and come back, or well, just like Gina, for example. So
Yes.
it's good to know them at the beginning, because if you pop in later, some of that story's already been told and it won't have the same grip on you as if you
Exactly.
right,
Exactly.
moving it forward.
Yes.
Let me check with Patrick and see if we have any questions.
Yeah, there are a few.
Sure.
All right, so Patrick is
Let's
going
see.
to give you questions from the audience here.
All right.
Sure. I'm ready.
Okay, Linda, can you hear me okay?
I sure can, Patrick. Hi.
It's great to see you,
Great to see you too.
albeit virtually. Well, this is interesting. There's somebody who's watching named Amy who mentions the series Orange is the New Black, and there is a character on there. One of the characters is Amish, and there's a plot twist I remember seeing it that delves into the whole Ragers thing, and she was wondering if you had seen that.
I have never watched that. I know of it, but I have never watched that.
It's
Maybe I should.
It's a great show. Let's see here. Okay, Susan asks, Linda, what did you write in high school? Have any of those ideas been used in your books?
That's such a great question. You know, you guys, I wrote my first book. I was 13 years old, and it was about two teenage girls who ran away from home on their Appaloosa horses. And you know, of course, it's terribly written. I thought the manuscript was long lost, and my dad passed away in the 90s, and I have three sisters. We are, you know, sort of going through his, you know, things, you know, trying to decide what we're gonna, you know, give away and donate and all of this stuff. I'm sitting at his desk. I open up the bottom drawer, and lo and behold, what do I find? I find that this spiral bound notebook. It was called The Long Journey. So I would say at that point in my life, the passion was there. I always loved to create characters. I always loved putting them into somewhat suspenseful or dangerous situations. And these two girls, I mean, they basically rode the horses across the United States. Their father was Native American on a reservation and in Arizona, and they rode from Peoria. So it was, you know, sort of an adventure, young adult story, I think. So yeah, I've, you know, I was too practical as a young adult to follow my dream of being a writer, but I've always loved writing and creating characters like that.
Okay, that's great. Amy also asks, will Noah ever return? Noah Mast. She says, I'm always hoping the next book will bring him back.
That's such a great question. You may not, Barbie, you may not remember Noah, and I kind of don't want to give away too much, but, and I'm not going to even mention the title of the book. It is the one book that I wrote where one of the bad guys got away.
I do remember.
And yes, and I have gotten mail about that book, and it's sort of in the back of my mind. I'm not exactly sure how to address that without giving something away to somebody who maybe hasn't read the book. I actually talked to my editor about that, and so it's sort of on a back burner for now. But if I think of something brilliant, I will address that issue.
Maybe you should forego the thought that you'll spoil one of your earlier books, because, you know, you could sort of fairly assume that people will have read it.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I could do that, or I could even do something in passing. And so yeah, but that Noah, he's still out there causing problems.
Okay, I think you may have addressed this already, but Jane asks, was Linda raised Amish or have family members who are Amish?
You know, I do get that question a lot. I received an email from a woman, and she was determined. She said either your mother was Amish or your grandmother was Amish. But you know, I was not raised Amish in any way. None of my relatives were Amish. But I, you know, of course, you know, I have been lucky enough to spend some time in the summertime mainly when I'm on book tour in Ohio. And I've been able to spend some time with a couple of different families. I got to drive a buggy one year, which was very interesting. And so no Anabaptist ancestry or Amish relation at all. That's a good question, though.
So that also prompts the question, why did you decide to write in the Amish community? What was it that drew you to the Amish as compared to any other kind of community you could have decided to?
I think really the main thing, there are a lot of reasons. One of the things is that it's just somewhat of a mysterious culture. It's a little, because they one of the Amish tenets is that they remain separate from the rest of the world. And, so many people don't know very much about them. They don't talk to them. They don't deal with them. Of course, a lot of the people in and around Ohio, where I go, yeah, they talk to the Amish. They do business with the Amish. Whatever kind of business, they shop in the grocery stores and all of that stuff. But I think generally speaking, there's a little bit of a mystery element there that was very intriguing to me as a writer. And another thing that I really love, being from Ohio, I'm actually from the western part of the state. I loved the whole idea of this bucolic countryside, Amish countryside, and the introduction of something evil into that, and that that really just appealed. I know it's a little twisted, but that really appealed to me as a writer, and that was one of the things I wanted to explore.
It's funny. This is my own question, Linda. A lot of us, our only real reference point for this culture is the movie Kingpin. Have you seen that classic comedy, Kingpin?
I have not.
What?
But I'm writing it down.
Oh man, I'm sure some of the people watching will chime in here. It is classic. You got to watch it. Kingpin.
Kingpin. Okay, yeah. I should be able to find it on iTunes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. No, you'll love it. Okay, so back to some legitimate questions here.
Wait, can I add one thing? If you are interested in more of the Amish culture, there is another mystery series by a man named P.L. Gauss, G-A-U-S. He wrote several books that were published by Penguin. Originally, I think, by the University of Ohio, I can't remember, one of the Ohio University things, and then picked up by Penguin. And I haven't seen one for a while, but he really, I thought they were fascinating. He wrote them differently than you did.
Yes.
He had trying to remember, was it a retired professor and a policeman and whatever, but he also really dealt with aspects of Amish culture that we wouldn't necessarily think of. I think I recommended him to you, didn't I? A long time
You did. I was actually supposed to do, this summer I was going to do an event with Paul and Amanda Flower. She writes Amish cozy mysteries. And I just remember, it's been a while since I read him, but they're just very intelligent and entertaining, and they're really, really good. His research is so right on, and it's so intricate, and that's one of the things I love about his work. So he's definitely still around. Unfortunately, I won't get to see him this summer, but maybe next year.
I'm really happy to hear that he's still there. I thought he did the Rumspringa thing as well as anybody. He had one book that really just aces that whole subject, and I thought it was fascinating. Okay, Patrick, back to you without a recommendation chart here.
Well, there are a couple of other authors who mentioned the movie Witness by Peter Ware, director, which is supposedly good.
Okay.
Let's see. Do you have a favorite of your own books? I mentioned earlier how I love each subsequent book more than the last, but book 7 is maybe my favorite. I love the mix of what's going on with Kate's life, the natural disaster, and the murder. It's got a lot, and it's beautifully done.
Book number 7, does she mention a title?
I can look it up.
I should know this.
No,
Was it
okay.
After the Storm?
Hang on. I will find it for you. Okay, let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yes, After the Storm.
Okay, yes. I was actually just talking about that book today, and that book was so spontaneous, and I have certain things that I really loved about that book, and I think there were also some scary things that happened with that book. Um, so I'm pleased that that's her favorite. I thought it was one of the better, more exciting Kate Burkholder stories. I have to tell you guys that I never read my own books. I never read them. When I finish a book, I turn it in, and of course, after edits, it's published and then it's out there. Well, my husband had not read the books, and we were doing a road trip. We recently moved from Amarillo down to Fredericksburg, Texas, which is 7 hours. I listened to one of the audiobooks from my husband, and we were in this vehicle, and it was Down a Dark Road, which I think was maybe the ninth book in the series. And I have to tell you, as a writer, I feel like listening to an audiobook sort of exaggerates mistakes. I'm thinking, oh, I shouldn't have done that, or I overdid that. But I have to tell you, that story, I'm glad it was dark, because I almost cried at the end. I loved the story, and it was totally unexpected. I thought, oh, it's going to be boring. I know what happens, but it was really interesting. I enjoyed it. I really liked it. So I think that's probably my favorite one.
Okay.
Heather Gudenkauf is watching, another author, and she asks, how do you keep track of all the details that are carried from one book to the next? Do you have a Bible for your own series?
Hi Heather. I do. It's actually more like a Word document, and I try when I add information, for example, information on different characters, on locations in town, on some of the establishments that are in town, and of course all of the minor characters that have happened in the past. Once you start getting several books into a series, it is very difficult to keep those details straight, and they have to be straight. One of the things that I haven't done that I really need to do is I need to make a map of Painter's Mill, because many times, being a police officer, I'm eastbound on Hog Path Road, and you sort of have to know where Hog Path Road is in relation to the covered bridge and things like that. So I do keep a big overall file, but one of the things I need to work on is a map.
Fair enough. And you could put it in the book too, which should be really interesting.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay, a question about, you mentioned that you like John Sanford. Any other favorite authors?
Oh, I love, Tammy Hogue. I've read Tammy Hogue for many, many years. Lisa Gardner is a favorite. Sandra Brown, Nora Roberts, Paul DeWarren is one of the more recent. He's one of the newer authors he does the Mike Bowditch series for St. Martin's.
They are so
John Hart. Yeah, and John Hart is another. He is an absolutely beautiful so it's almost like he's got just this beautiful literary prose. He's another one that I snap up his books the moment they come out.
I'm really glad you mentioned Paul Darwin. We did his virtual launch last week with Tess Garrison, and I think that this 11th book of his is, like you, he did something truly different with his character.
Oh.
And I think it's just fabulous. He has truly grown every book as a writer, and the characters have again also grown. And I wish that people would go back to The Poacher's Son and then read him forward. It's interesting how sometimes you have to write 10 or 11 books to really get attention. Other people can do it in one or two, and I've never quite worked out why some series take longer to attract readers. But I'm happy to say that I think it's happening for Paul, and he's just he's a really nice man, but he's an incredible writer. Great anchor in the landscape. Like you, he's very good at painting the whole landscape of the book and the diverse characters.
Yeah. Set in Maine. I actually had the pleasure of meeting Paul. It was at BoucherCon in Cleveland, and it's been a few years ago, but just very nice man. I think we did sort of a small event together, and that was the first time I'd met him. But my foundage has grown a lot throughout the series, and you're absolutely correct. The way that the beauty of Maine, I've never been to Maine. The way that he depicts that, it makes me want to go there.
Well, this book will also...
As long as I'm not killed.
Well, one of the things you'll like about One Last Light, his new book, is that it's a border book. It's the Maine-Canadian border and the St. John's River and the communities that have had for centuries crossed back and forth over that river and now can't because the border has been closed. And that's one of the elements of the book. And really, it's just spectacular. So I'm delighted. I will put you two together next year because you always publish right on top of each other.
Oh, we do. I would so love that, Barbara. I would love that.
Great.
Yes. He's my next read.
Sarah, are you listening? Sarah's the publicist, so I think we can probably work that out. Is there any other question, Patrick?
Nope.
Okay. So you did mention that you are working on a new book. I always like to leave people delighted to think that there will be another book. Still Kate? Still
yes.
on Painter's Mill?
Yes. Kate Burkholder, I'm about, I don't know, maybe 2/3 of the way finished with the book. I'm trying to think of a way. The title, by the way, we do have the title. It is Fallen.
Okay.
And it's a very fitting title. I'm trying to think of a way to describe it without giving away too much. Basically, what happens in the book is a young woman who is formerly Amish, grew up in Painter's Mill. Kate used to babysit for her when she was a kid, and leaves Painter's Mill, several years before. Well, Kate gets a call, and this young woman that she had once babysat for, this formerly Amish woman, is found murdered in a motel room. And Kate has to figure out, it's a very brutal murder, and Kate has to figure out, who did this and why was she back in town? Why did she leave? And it really is a really kind of an intense mystery. And so this is more heavy on the mystery as opposed to, thriller or police procedural even.
So we often get this question, so I will end with it. Did you know when you started the book where it was going, or are you surprising yourself as you're working your way along?
Generally speaking, I knew where I was going. Sometimes in the course of the book, usually about 3/4 of the way through, I'm pounding my head against my desk, trying to figure out exactly how we're going to get there. But I sort of know in a general way where I'm going. Sometimes it takes me a little while to figure out all the ins and outs of exactly how I'm going to get there, but I usually do know the end. Thank goodness.
That was the question. All right. Well, thank you. It's been delightful to spend time with you. Where is your wine? I thought you were going to have a healthy sip of wine, and I'm almost
exactly right here.
I'm almost out of this wretched water. But a toast to you, and yet another wonderful book. Thank you so much, Linda. And I want to thank all of you who joined us for this virtual launch. Please do order a copy of the book, and if you haven't read Linda, start at the beginning. So have a wonderful evening. Thank you.